You want to turn in your Bibles to the book of Genesis. That's where we'll be getting started this evening. It's kind of fortunate that we'll be singing Who Will Follow Jesus tonight, because tonight we're going to be talking about Jesus. Tonight's sermon has a little bit of a different, it's not going to mean that much, it's going to sound like just any other sermon I give, but from the writing perspective, it has a little bit of a different approach than I normally preach. Normally when I preach a sermon, my hope is to get one point across to you. Every preacher will tell you that they're going to have multiple points in the sermon, but they know the audience is probably only going to take about one or two away, two if you're lucky. So when I write a sermon, I have one point that I'm trying to get across. Tonight, I'm not trying to get across a point as it more is a tool or a technique that I've recently discovered that's been very helpful for me. There is a famous quote that this is how the story for this technique got started for me, from a professor down at Florida College by the name of Professor Peeler, as some of you may know. And I was told I had to do this quote in his voice, but I'm not going to attempt it. I'm sorry. But the quote is that if you're trying to make a list of every time Jesus appears in the Old Testament, and that list does not contain the entirety of the Old Testament, then that list is too short. Now that sounds like a cop-out, and that is my first gut reaction when I heard it. That's like if you ask someone, like, what's your favorite Bible verse? And you're like, oh, I just can't pick. It's like, all right, come on. Like, you got one. I know you do. The problem is that the more and more I started thinking about it, the more I realized that it's kind of accurate. The whole Old Testament points to Jesus, and that's something that we know. As Christians, that is something that you just kind of have instilled in you, is you know that the Old Testament exists to show us that Jesus is coming. That's the whole point of the book of Hebrews, is talking about types and shadows that we see in the Old Testament that are fulfilled in Christ. And of course, we know that there are messianic prophecies. That's one of Jesus' greatest evidences to his authority is the prophecies. He has the miracles, and the prophecies are his biggest authority, that he can say, look at what I have accomplished, look at what I have done, you can see that I am the Christ. And so if we say, where's Jesus in the Old Testament, many people will point to Psalms and talk about, and the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my feet until I make your enemies your footstool. Like, that's obviously pointing to Jesus. Or point to Isaiah, talking about, like, a lamb led before slaughter is silent, so he opened not his mouth. Or point to the minor prophets, I think it's Micah, I should have written this down, where it's talking about him being born of a virgin. Like, obviously that's pointing to Jesus. But where is Jesus in, like, Genesis 5? It's just a bunch of genealogies. It's just a bunch of names. Like, where can I find Jesus in that? And so tonight what I want to do is just go with you for the first few. We're going to be looking at the first 11 chapters of Genesis, and we're going to be finding Jesus in every chapter. Now I'm going to give you three ways that you can find Jesus in the Old Testament. The first one is when it clearly states, this is Jesus. Like, it could say it pretty obviously in the Old Testament, like when Moses prophesies about the great prophet that is coming, that's clearly talking about the Messiah. Or when it tells you in the New Testament, and we're going to see that right out of the gate, in the New Testament it tells you, hey, in the Old Testament when it said that, it was talking about Jesus. The second one is where it alludes to Jesus. This is the one where you can make a really good point in Bible class, if you can point this out, where you're like, oh, I see that, like, if you kind of look at it in this light, then Jesus is here. The third one is the least obvious one, but it's something that's paramount in the Old Testament. The third version, and we're not going to see this until chapter 3, is if there is a problem that is being spoken about, and the answer to that problem is Christ. That's going to be the biggest point I'm going to bring out towards the end here, because there's a big point I'm going to bring out of chapters, around chapters 7 through 11 about that. So the three versions are when it's super obvious, when they pretty much tell you it's Jesus. The second one is where it alludes to Jesus. And the third one is when it brings up a problem that Jesus is the answer to. So the first one that we can find, the first reference to Jesus you can find in the Bible, is Genesis 1:1. And this is the most painfully obvious one because the Apostle John tells us that it's Jesus. So Genesis 1:1 starts this way. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form, void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. Okay, stick your finger in Genesis. Turn to John with me. The Gospel of John, chapter 1. This is kind of cheating. If you ever want a really good study, find all the references to Genesis in the book of John. I'm going to give you 2 for free. But there's a lot that John references the book of Genesis. First 3 words of Genesis, in the beginning. First 3 words of John, in the beginning. John 1:1 says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him. Without him nothing was made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it." Like, that is so obviously referencing Genesis. I don't have anything to tell you more, because John just says, "In the beginning was the Word." He's talking about Genesis. So when we read the words, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth," we know that Jesus is here. We know that that's Jesus. And even more so, the first thing created was light. And there's a separation between the light and the darkness. And John points it out that Jesus is the light. And that the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness does not comprehend it. I'm not saying that Jesus was created on the first day. I had someone bring that up to me on that. John 1 clearly states that the Word, which is Christ, was there from the beginning. That Jesus wasn't created on the first day. But there is definitely a thing to be said that the first thing created is light. And then John says that Jesus is the light of men, that Jesus is the first of creation. Jesus is the first fruits of creation, is how he's often referenced. This idea that Jesus came first. So that's the obvious one. That's the first tip. There's another reference to Jesus in chapter 1 as well. If we'll jump down, in verse 26 it says this. "Then God said, 'Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over the cattle, over all, over the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth.' So God created man in his own image, and in the image of God, God created him. Male and female he created them. Then God blessed them, and God said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish over the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth.'" Okay, so the obvious thing that I can say here is that Jesus was man and that man was created here, but that's not the point I'm going for. Notice who was created here. It was Adam. Adam was created here at the beginning, and Adam's purpose as creation is to be God's own image. That is why Adam was created, is that he is made in the image of God. Everything that Adam does is supposed to reflect God. Does anybody know who the first disciple was? The first person who was called to follow Jesus? The person who was called to be like Jesus, that in his life he would strive to be Jesus' disciple, his follower? It was Andrew. Andrew and Adam are the same name. My brother learned that, and we realized that our parents literally named us both Adam or Andrew Smith. We have the same name. But the point is that Andrew means man. It's the Greek word for the Hebrew name Adam. Jesus is right there. God made Adam to be in his own image, and the first person Jesus called to follow after him is named Adam. You see Jesus here. Okay, let's go to chapter 2. Again, I'm going to get a little bit, sometimes I'm going to actually start preaching and bring out some application points, but I got to remind myself that I'm not trying to give you a lesson, I'm trying to give you a tool here. This is something that when you read through the Old Testament, you can do very easily. Pick any chapter and you can do what I'm trying to teach you tonight. So chapter 2 is obvious. We have Adam and Eve. We can talk about Adam again. There is something to be said about Adam having a job to tend over the garden and to rule over earth, and then Jesus is the one who comes and is given dominion over earth. But the stronger point that you can see in chapter 2 is what is created in chapter 2. Something that goes on to this day is marriage. Marriage is instituted on the 6th day that's shown in chapter 2. What does Ephesians say about marriage? For sake of time, we're not going to... Oh, wait, no. This is a Sunday night. I got all the time in the world. Let's turn to Ephesians. I preached this sermon first on a Sunday morning, and you have less time to preach on a Sunday morning. So turning to Ephesians... Ephesians chapter 5 is where Paul breaks down and starts talking about how husbands and wives should relate to each other, the relationship that you should have. In chapter 5, verse 22, he says this: "Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, and he is the Savior of the body. Therefore, just as the church is subject to Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ also loved the church. He gave himself for her with the washing of water by the word, that he might present her to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she should be holy without blemish. So husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it. But the Lord does, just as the Lord does the church. For we are members of his body, and his flesh and of his bones. For this reason a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. Nevertheless, let each one of you in particular so love his wife as himself, and let his wife see that he respects her husband." What's interesting about this, and this is where you can see the wisdom of God that is so much greater than our own wisdom, is that Paul's metaphor here, it goes both ways. So he uses the example of, look at how Christ loved us, and that's how husbands should love the church. And look at how the church loves Christ, and that's how wives should love Christ. But then he makes the point that, all right, while I'm using Christ and the church as an example to explain how your marriage should be, you need to understand that marriage was created so that we can understand Christ's love for the church. And it's this point that he's making here, is that it's not that Paul was looking around and being like, all right, I need a good way to explain how Christ and the church are related. He literally just said, it's marriage. Marriage was created so that we can learn this. That's the whole reason why God created marriage. Yeah, it is not good for man to be alone. There is that definite part of that. Of course, there's multiple stages to this. But God's main purpose for creating marriage was to show us Christ's love for the church. You can see this in a similar fashion about how God is our Father, and the fact that they use that all the time, that we see this parental bond was created so that we can understand our relationship with God the Father. That same relationship, God created marriage in chapter 2 to point us to Jesus. That is something that astounded me the first time it clicked in. Like, I knew, of course, that marriage was Christ and the church. Like, that was something that I had ridden a pew for 25 years now of my life. Like, that's something I just kind of knew on the back burner. But something that clicked, that on the 6th day of creation, God created a type and shadow so that however many thousands of years later today, I can make the point to you that Christ loves the church the way the husband should love the wife, and vice versa. God created that in the beginning. The first week of creation, God set that up. That was a really neat moment when it clicked into place. All right, let's go back to Genesis. Genesis chapter 3 has a lot. Because Genesis chapter 3 is the first time that we get all three examples. The super obvious, the illusion, and then a problem exists that Christ is the solution. So that problem that exists, what's the first thing that we see in chapter 3 is the fall of man. Sin enters the world. And this is the first time you can see there is a problem in creation, that the only solution is Christ. That's just a small example. We're going to get into that point a lot later. We're going to get into that point a lot later. I don't want to terrify anybody that I just said a lot later. I want to make sure that emphasis was correct. Well, the super obvious one is the one that we all know. This is the first messianic prophecy, is here in chapter 3. Verse 15, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." Some translations say, "He shall crush your head, and you shall bruise his heel. The idea here is plain and simple. That is Jesus. God here, when we always say, in the beginning, God had a plan. That's what we're talking about. When man fell, when sin entered the world, God already had the example. God already had the way to solve it, and that was Christ. However many thousands of years it took place between Genesis and 0 AD, or 33 AD, I guess, that is what the plan was. Right here. That's super obvious. We know that one. But there's an allusion to Christ here too. Something that says, hey, here's another type of Christ in chapter 3. Does anybody know, and I keep asking questions because this is a sermon, so don't feel like you have to answer. But does anybody know where the first death takes place in the Bible? I'm going to steal this point just egregiously because Sam isn't here because he's the one who pointed it out to me. The first death in the Bible is not Abel. It happens right here. After the fall of man and the curses and the promises are made, in verse 20 of chapter 3, and Adam called his wife name Eve because she was the mother of all living. Also, for Adam and his wife, the Lord made tunics of skin and clothed them. Where did the skin come from? God killed something to pay for Adam and Eve's sin. The nakedness, the shame that Adam and Eve had on them resulted in death. This is the first type of sacrifice for sin that we see. And of course, you read through Leviticus, it's really easy to find Jesus. Every sacrifice points to Christ. Every single one. So also for Adam and his wife, the Lord made tunics of skin and clothed them. That is a point that you memorize when you're in the little kids class because it's a trivia question. But that points to Christ. Why do I need Christ? Because my sin requires death. Adam and Eve's sin required death. And so God made tunics of skin. Okay. Those are some big points. I hope you're catching on with the tool because we're going to hit some heavy points now. Not that the other ones weren't heavy. Chapter 4. What's the big thing from chapter 4? Cain kills Abel. So there's some obvious ones you can go for here. There's sacrifices that Abel makes. Abel makes a sacrifice that's better than Cain's. We can talk about Christ's sacrifice being superior. Side point, this has absolutely nothing to do with the sermon, but since I have a captive audience, I don't think Cain's sacrifice was wrong because it was grain. I think there was something else involved because in Leviticus there are grain offerings. There are grain sacrifices that God requires. There's something else at play. I've just heard people be like, oh, well, God didn't like Cain's because it was grain. Well, God asked for grain sacrifices later. So whatever the problem was, Cain sins, and then Abel dies. I realize that Cain kills Abel here, but let's take out that part first and just look at it very basically. Cain sins, Abel dies. What does that sound like to you? Kind of sounds like I sin and Jesus dies. Like that's there. That's what we see here is that my sin results in another's death. Well, let's take it a step further. Romans talks about the idea that we are adopted into the family of God, that God is our adoptive father. Well, if we're adopted into the family of God and God is our father, what is our relation to Jesus now? He is now our brother. And so our brother has died because of our sin. I sinned, my brother dies. Okay, let's take it one step further. Hebrews 10 makes the point that us who are in the church, those who know the truth of the faith, those who have received the knowledge of the truth, is the language depending on your translation. For when we sin willfully, we once again crucify the Son of Man. It's not the Romans who crucified Jesus. It's not the Jews who are responsible for the death of Jesus. It's us. When I sin willfully, after receiving the knowledge of the truth, I once again sacrifice the Son of Man. I hope you're seeing the connection here because I'm repeating it a lot. When I sin, I kill my brother. when Cain sinned, he killed Abel. God makes the point so clearly to Cain that sin is lying at the door. It's asking for you. You must rule over it. And that's a challenge for us, that we see that we are required to rule over our sin. Because when we sin, especially those of us who are baptized, when we have accepted Christ as the payment for our sin, every time we sin, Christ has to die again. Every time I sin, I am Cain putting my brother Abel to death. The guilty is killing the innocent. There's another point to be made too, that what's famous about Abel, of famous characters in the Bible, is that he did not speak once. Well, at least for our recording. Abel has no dialogue in the Bible. Hebrews makes the point that through his death he still speaks to us. But what I find also interesting is that Isaiah quote that we referenced, that like a lamb led to slaughter is silent, so he opened not his mouth. Abel doesn't have a single line of dialogue, and he died for his brother's sin. That points to Jesus pretty hard. Okay, chapter 5. This is the one that I find fun, because I am not a big fan of genealogies. I one time heard Nolan Baker at this very pulpit say that the first 2 chapters of Chronicles doesn't matter because it's just genealogies, and I thought it was real funny. Genealogies are boring. I'm going to say that right now. But it's boring because it's just repetitive. It's just a list of guys. Now, the obvious way that I can point to chapter 5 and say, oh, this is where Jesus is that this is Jesus' genealogy. That's why these men in particular are brought up. It's why it says Adam and then Seth. That's why Seth is mentioned, not Cain, or however many other sons Adam had. Seth is brought up because that's Jesus' line. All of these men are brought up because they're Jesus' line. But here's where that third example starts to kick in. A problem that arises in this chapter that is solved by Jesus. Let me read verse 5 for you, and then I'm going to go a little bit farther down. So all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. Seth lived 105 years and begot Enosh. And after he begot Enosh, Seth lived 807 years. And so the sons and daughters, so all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. Enosh lived 90 years and begot Canaan. And after he begot Canaan, Enosh lived 815 years and had sons and daughters. So all the days of Enosh were 905 years, and he died. I can keep on reading, but I'm going to stop there. Did y'all notice something that repeats at the end of every paragraph if you have paragraph Bibles? And he died. And he died. And he died. What if everything went according to plan? Would have been different about Adam's sentence if the fall of man, Genesis 3, never happened? What would be different about the end of Adam's paragraph? It wouldn't have ended with, and he died. He has access to the tree of life in Genesis. He has the ability to live with God forever. But sin enters the world and death with it. Adam dies, Enosh dies, Canaan dies. All of the genealogies that we're going to read through every genealogy that's in the Bible, every single one of those men is dead. You can argue Enoch, but that's not the point that I'm trying to make. All of these people died. All of the sons and daughters that it says that they had, all of them are dead. That is a problem that is solved through Jesus. That is that famous, oh, death, where's your victory? Oh, death, where's your sting? It seems like there's a lot of victories here. It seems like death keeps winning them, like every genealogy. And he died, and he died. Death keeps winning them. But the reason why we who are here in the future, beyond these people, can say, oh, death, where is your victory? Oh, death, where is your sting? Is because Genesis 5 points us to Christ. Notice that this is the genealogy of Christ. Every single one of them die. Jesus dies and then lives again. This points us to Christ. Okay. So this has been kind of some base level, some interesting things that we've been seeing. Chapter 6 through chapter 11 is one of my favorite sections in this sermon. because a point got brought up to me that I had never noticed before in this. It was recently. Seth Malden, Leon Malden's son, if you know him, is who pointed this out to me, that I hadn't even put it together. Chapter 6 is the wickedness of man. And this is where we talk about the Nephilim, and that's a completely another sermon for another day. And then we get Noah. Hebrews makes the point very easily that Noah is a type of Christ because by building the ark, he judged the earth in the way that Christ judges the earth. That Noah, by saving his family, condemned everyone else. The way that when Christ saves us, he condemns everyone else. And then also easily with the flood. That's another type 1 example where the New Testament just tells us that the flood is a type of baptism. And we know that baptism is a representation of Christ's death. 1 Peter makes the point that there is now an antitype, which now saves us. The antitype is to the flood. The flood is the first type. The antitype is baptism. The reason why it's an antitype is because Noah stayed out of the water and we go into the water. That's why it's an antitype. So those are obvious. We can see Jesus there. But the point that I want to bring out is the chapters that follow the flood. So why did the flood happen? The flood happened because God looked down on his creation and he sees, I think the quote exactly is, that man's mind was on evil continually. The idea is that there was sin so rampant in the earth that God was ashamed of us. God was upset with himself for making this. Remember in Genesis 1 that he pronounced everything good. He's doing the opposite now. Nothing is good. So God decides to clear the earth and start over. He chooses Noah, a righteous man, so that Noah and his family of righteous people will be safe from the sin of the world. He's going to clear out the sin, and that God will let Noah start earth again following a righteous family. Doesn't that sound nice? Like, this is the first time I ever think I've talked about mass murder in a sermon. But like, wouldn't it be nice if all the like evildoers in the world were just kind of like gone? Oh, like it'd be so nice. Like, sometimes my car doesn't beep loud enough when I honk it, and then I have to walk back to my car to make sure it's locked. What if like car thieves just didn't exist? Wouldn't have to worry about it. That'd be so nice. What about like every evil act you can think of, or every evil doer, every person you just don't like? What if every problem just didn't exist? Like, yeah, I'll live on a boat for 40 days and 40 nights, or however long Noah was on it. I know it's longer than that. If that means that when I get off the boat, my life is just perfect, because everything that's wrong with the world is just fixed. That sounds so nice. Here's the problem. After that catastrophe, after God purged the earth of all sin, what does Noah do immediately after he gets off the boat? He plants a vineyard and gets drunk. And then there's that whole situation with Ham that I don't even want to get into that happens. All right, so chapter 7 is the flood. Chapter 8 is the new covenant. Chapter 9 is this whole drunkenness and going on. And then also the Ham thing. Chapter 10 is another genealogy. And then chapter 11. That's the Tower of Babel. That is one of the most sinful situations you see outside of like Sodom and Gomorrah. This Tower of Babel, these men who are so prideful that they decide that I'm going to be God now. God has just wiped humanity from existence save for 6 people. And then decides to restart. And then man is like, you know what? We don't need God now. I'm going to build this great tower. And we'll live all under one city. And we'll be the gods. What was the point of the flood? What was the point of anything that was done? You know when I was talking about earlier about how nice it would be if everyone who did something wrong would just go away? Yeah, that would involve me and you. If everyone who was sinful just went away, no one would be here. The whole idea is that sin still enters the world through Noah. Noah is the first person we see to sin get off the boat. The man that God selected from however many people lived on the earth at that point It could have been just as populated as it is today. From, let's say, 7 billion people, God picks one person, which is a ridiculous statistic if you want to get into the math side of it. God picks one person in his family that they're going to be the ones to restart the earth because they're the righteous ones. You know, it would have made more sense if Ham's sin came first. Because Ham wasn't the one that God picked. Ham got grandfathered in. It was Noah that sinned first. The man who God selected in and of himself. The man who, like literally, we talk about baptism, the belief of salvation that we have, we reference Noah a lot. This is the guy whose sin re-enters the world from. So, what was the point of the flood then? Now, I'm not going to pretend that I know the mind of God, and I do believe that God's shame and God wanting to restart the earth, probably there was a lot to do with that. But a point that I think that the flood happened for was a lesson for us today. That God's wrath, God's great judgment on the earth, it's not going to save any of us. If God's wrath is the only way to save us from sin, we're all going to perish. Because if one of us live, sin lives. If only Noah got off the boat, Noah's the one who re-entered sin into the earth. None of us can save ourselves from sin. God's wrath alone, the only way to finish off sin, to get rid of sin through God's wrath, is to kill every single one of us. Or he sends us Christ. Because we're not perfect. I'm sure every single one of us would have brought sin back into the world if we were the ones picked to build the ark. Because as long as man exists, sin will exist. It's a hard truth to realize that we cannot be perfect. Man cannot fix itself. The only thing that fixes sin is Christ's love for us. That's the point of the flood. The point of the flood is to show us how desperately we need Christ. Because if we don't have Christ, the only answer to our sin is annihilation. Is the fiery judgment that Hebrews 10 talks about. That certain fear of fiery judgment. You can see Christ everywhere in the Old Testament. This point here of the flood is to point us to Christ. Okay, so once again, if you wanted to see what's the point of Adam's sermon, I don't really have one big point. Except that the Old Testament points us to Christ, that we need Christ. This is a fun tool to use. If you're ever studying through the Old Testament, you just whip this guy out and just try and find Jesus in it. It's real fun for me, but that might just be because I preach for a living, and so I kind of think about these things a lot. But if you're ever studying through the Old Testament, please try and use this technique. Just find Jesus wherever he is. If it's super obvious, it straight up tells you that it's Jesus. If it alludes to Jesus, like if there's a death, normally Jesus is involved. Or just look for a problem that is introduced in the Old Testament that is solved by Christ. So it's kind of perfect that we are singing Who Will Follow Jesus as the invitation song. I kind of chuckled to myself when it was announced because it fits the sermon pretty well. The idea is that all of this is pointing us to Christ so that we follow him. The same way that Adam was created so that Andrew would follow. That Andrew is the one who's supposed to be the type of Christ. We follow the same way, that we are to follow and to be Christ's image on this earth. If anyone here needs the help of this church in any way, if it be through baptism into Christ's name to become that image of Christ, or if you just need the help of this church to get back on the way, we'd be more than glad to help you. If either be your case, come forward as we stand.